Hello, and thanks for listening to my talk, which is entitled Stay All Night, I Dare You, Age Imaginaries in an Ethnography of an Indie Rock Band. This is my first time giving a remote presentation, so please bear with me. It's going to be a combination of me reading you some sort of more key extracts of the presentation, followed by some discussions of some of the sort of broader reflective themes that I want to cover during this talk, and I'm speaking to you from the field as well, so if any loud music emerges in the background, that will explain that. Okay, so I will quickly run over the abstract for this paper to give you an idea of what I'd like to talk about in the next 15 minutes and to remind anyone who hasn't managed to read the abstract of what the talk is going to be about. So this paper will explore the emerging findings and fieldwork experiences of an ongoing long-term ethnography of the indie rock band The Wedding Presents. The ethnography focuses on the ways in which knowledge construction and learning take place within the community of practice of a rock band. I also focus specifically on the interface between music and imaginings of age as an aspect of social identity. So in this paper I will address these issues both in relation to the substantive questions of the ethnography and in terms of my personal reflections on participant observation as an active member of the band. So I want to briefly present to you the subject matter of the ethnography, but also to reflect on how I'm kind of critically and actively engaged in negotiating these themes as part of the fieldwork as well. I want to draw on the concept of situated learning, age imaginaries, and on the work of Simon Frith, and then also generally on Small's idea of musicking, to consider A, the way that learning takes place among a group of musicians who have no musical literacy or any kind of formal training in music, and B, the ways in which music frames ideas about age and social identity as much for the fans as for band members and for people like me, the social anthropologists, who they occasionally tolerate. So I do so within the context of an ethnographic vignette which describes performing the Wedding Present song Dare during a 20-year anniversary tour of their 1991 album Sea Monsters, and you'll be able to see a clip of that at the end of the presentation. So the outline of the seminar is to quickly go over some concepts that are kind of important to the ethnographic work that I'm doing. So to have a look at social theories of learning and the idea of communities of practice, to go over the idea of age imaginaries, and then to explore how that relates to social identity and media consumption, so ideas about youth, subcultures, and music. Part two, I'd like to explore how these ideas come together in the field, specifically looking at my own reflections on experiences of the field, and then part three will consider a performance of the band's song Dare at a concert in New York in 2012. Okay, so first let's explore how social theories of learning might be applied to rock music, which might, to begin with, sound a little bit sort of incoherent, but let's have a go. So, as I've mentioned already, this talk explores an ongoing project which began in 2012, and it explores the negotiation of situated learning, performance, and identity in the context of a musical group. The project draws on social theories of learning from people like Levin Wenger in order to explore the processes that underpin how learning takes place in an informal, situated, and relational way within the community of practice of a rock band. And in particular, I explore how individuals with no formal training, so people who've never learnt their instruments formally, either as musicians or as participants in the sort of figured world of the music industry, how these people are capable of articulating and formulating ideas about music and then creating, performing, and recording music as a result of this collaboration. So within this process, I explore the relational, social nature of the learning that takes place, not only in terms of collaboratively learning songs and creating music, but also on a more profound level in terms of the creative activity and knowledge that goes into learning to be a quote-unquote rock musician. So how individuals co-construct notions of identity and develop the performative practices that shape these identities, both on stage, during explicit performances, and off stage as well. And the sort of key thing that I want to sort of put forward, I suppose, is that the underlying themes of this research, how learning is constructed socially and relationally, and how learning relates to identity and practice, how these ideas have resonance for educational research, not only in the context of so-called informal spaces of learning, but also for rethinking critically the boundaries of formal schooling, so how these ideas can be applied to formal settings for education. As I said, the context of a rock band may seem a novel and slightly unusual setting in which to explore the social theories of learning, identity construction, and performance. However, there is a significant body of literature that has explored how learning takes place in non-formal settings, and within musical communities of practice, so-called in particular. So this is something that stretches back quite far in the sort of history of educational research, arguably to Vygotsky and possibly even before. It's the work of scholars like Lev that's helped to establish the importance of viewing learning as a form of practice that is fundamentally social in its construction and therefore contingent on social, cultural, and historical and political context. So much work in the field of anthropology and sociology of education has sought to expand notions of learning and knowledge to incorporate practices of groups as diverse, for example, as Melanesian fishermen or inner-city gangs in the United States. And Lev's work among tailors in Liberia served to demonstrate, as an example of this, how creative activity and the production of new knowledge, what might be called learning, is not restricted solely to the forms of education legitimated within a particular social and political order, so what we would recognize as formal education and their associated regimes of assessment. So instead, framing learning as a social and situated practice allows educational researchers to expand the boundaries of analysis to include not only learning within the confines of a particular activity and or community of practice, so making clothes, secondary students in an English class, or PGC students learning to be teachers, musicians in a rock band, but it also places these activities within a broader context, and in so doing helps to reveal the connectedness of this context to other aspects of social and cultural life. So crucially, what's most important about this, I think, is that it helps to illuminate issues of social inequality that may underpin the privileging of certain approaches to education, teaching, learning, and ultimately knowledge. To learning in a rock band. There are quite a few different sort of theoretical ideas that help us to frame this research, and I'll skip over some of the sort of larger sections of text here, but the key thing to take away from this is the idea that a rock band can be considered a community of practice where people, even if they're not focusing on learning explicitly, are actually learning from each other. And in the case of this particular rock band, this happens in an explicit way in terms of learning songs or relearning old songs that the band's already performed, but also in a kind of implicit and slightly more subtle and complex way in terms of learning to play together in this particular instantiation of the band and to learn to play together in the very particular context of individual performances. We can also consider learning and sort of creative construction of knowledge to take place in informal context within this informal setting, if you like, so not only within the context of playing music, rehearsing music, creating music, but also in the kind of informal activities that make up the broader life of the band, so things like loading the van, getting to rehearsals, driving to shows, all the other things that happen within a rock band that aren't directly related to music. So in this case, the subjective role of an individual within a musical community of practice is therefore at once to participate with agency in creative processes and to collaborate in the process of co-constructing the figured world of the music group within a broader social, cultural, and historical context. The final theoretical framing that I want to include here is this idea of imaginaries, so the ways in which learning might be framed not only imaginatively, so not only creatively, but also in relation to imagined ideas about how one should act in a particular context. This idea of how things ought to be if you're a rock musician, if you play in a rock band. So we have these kind of competing ideas. On one hand, lived experiences and people's ability to imaginatively co-construct these experiences, but also an idea of how things ought to be that we bring in to those contexts as well. Okay, so when thinking about imaginaries, it's also important, particularly within the context of this project, to think about age imaginaries and how media consumption and age come together in terms of imagined social identity. So a lot of the research that I've done today has focused on this idea of age imaginaries and how we imagine ourselves through different proxies like media consumption in terms of age. This is drawing on a well-established tradition of research in cultural studies, anthropology, and sociology that links media consumption, and especially music, to the social construction of identity, and especially in relation to youth, so people like Adorno, Reisman, CCCS, Stuart Hall, lots of other people. And so in the particular case of the band that I want to go on to talk about next, I want to be thinking about this idea of age imaginaries, how we imaginatively think about how age is figured as an aspect of social identity, particularly in connection with music and music consumption. And this is as much part of the project itself as it is sort of part of the fieldwork experience for me. Okay, and as we go into the ethnographic vignette, I think I can hear somebody tuning up in the background, so this might get a bit noisy. Okay, so a quick introduction before we go into the sort of detail. A quick introduction to the band, The Wedding Present. It's a band that's been going since the late 1980s. It's been going more or less continuously since then. Has quite a sort of dedicated following in the UK, but also internationally as well. I've been involved in the band for about 2 years. During most of that time, I've been doing some form of ethnographic work with the band. But as with most fruitful ethnographic contexts, it's also a result of sort of personal happenstance. So I'm very aware that it's a combination of those two things. And there's the music in the background. So lots of present are now in their kind of late 30s or early 40s. Started listening to the band in the late 1980s. And so age is a really sort of key factor in terms of how they figure their appreciation of this band, I think, and this is kind of reflected in a recent review of the band that starts out with saying, "There is nothing quite like music for helping you mark the passage of time. It's an odd sensation, a simultaneous wave of nostalgia combined with a realization of your own inevitable aging, and it can feel a little bit disconcerting." And I think that's definitely an experience as much for the fans and for the band as it is for me within the context of the fieldwork. So realizing that as I get older, my experience of music is different, and certainly it's become sort of professionalized in an academic way as well as in a sort of musical sense. So the process of aging and of imagining my own age identity is also happening alongside what's happening for the band and for the fans. So I think this quote, as I say, speaks to the complex interplay between music consumption and imaginings of age as an aspect of a social identity. Music consumption, and the consumption of rock music in particular, has long been associated with the construction of teenage identity and so-called youth subcultures. However, in the present, in the 21st century, the relationship between age identity and music consumption is far more complex. So really, the Wedding Present sums this up because it's one of an increasingly large number of long-standing musical groups whose appeal is at once intergenerational. So it could be original fans and their kids. It's nostalgic for people who are listening to the band because it reminds them of being young. And it's also fundamentally premised on its significance as a medium for constructing ideas about youth, even among fans who are well beyond the chronological limits of being young. So this is, sometimes the case for people reliving their youth for one night when they come and see the band and listen to songs they heard first when they were a teenager. In terms of going back to those ideas about situated learning, social learning, and constructing knowledge, there are a huge range of different ways in which we might think about how this learning takes place. And to give a few very recent examples, we might think about these kind of very loose discussions that happen in rehearsals for a band like the Wedding Present, who aren't musically trained. None of us can speak in kind of musical language. None of us are musically literate. So if we're rehearsing a song, we might talk about it in terms that really only we understand. So if we're talking about how many times we do a particular riff before we go into the next part, we just say, that bit where you go da-da-da-na-na-na-na, we'll do that 8 times or however many times it is, and then we come back in when you do that loud thing. And that kind of language happens all the time. And that might also come into how people talk in sound checks. So when we're trying to set up for a performance, and if you want a particular instrument in your monitor, we often say things like, can you bring the drums up, or can you bring the guitar up a fraction? None of us are speaking in exact terms, but somehow everybody in that context knows what we're talking about. It also comes into things like performance, how to perform in a way that isn't affected, but also that shows you're engaged with the music. So, to go into a bit more detail, for me, this has happened in a lot of ways through the fieldwork. What I'm exploring in terms of the substantive subject matter of the ethnography is really part of what I do in the band. So, I came to the band as an unskilled musician, and I had to learn to become a part of this community of practice in that very particular way. And this is maybe something that's specific to this kind of the kind of DIY ethic, the politics of indie music in particular, that it's almost expected that you're not skilled, and in fact being skilled would potentially be a hindrance rather than a help to your ability to function in this particular community of practice. So it's always about almost downplaying your ability while recognizing that you have a certain ability to play and to perform without having any kind of formal training. There's a certain kind of prestige associated with that combination of knowing but not knowing. Again, going back to that idea of what language is valued and what language to speak, oftentimes this language can be quite vague, and for someone outside of that context you wouldn't necessarily know what it meant. But having been socialized into this small community of practice, you learn how these conversations work. It's also about informal contexts, so things like going to the pre-tour curry or having a beer before and after the show, these kinds of informal contexts where music is always there even if no music is playing. We're always talking about music or talking about the show, and having, being able to learn how to do that in the right way in order to fit in. Finally, we might think about performance, and I'm calling it here the right kind of rocking out, because particularly for this kind of music, there's an expectation, I think, that you're involved in the music, you're engaged in it, you're almost lost in it, but not so lost that you don't that you fail to perform. But at the same time, it's not ostentatious. You have to, there isn't a kind of overplaying or sort of it's not an overplaying of that performance. You can't do it too much, and it's a very fine line to balance between being lost in the music but not showing off, I suppose, is one way of putting it. I'm conscious that I'm running out of time and probably also running out of volume competing with the band playing downstairs, so I'd like to finish now by showing you a vignette from this ongoing ethnography, which is a performance of the song Dare. And I think that one of the lines in the chorus, "Stay all night, I dare you," is quite poignant, both from the perspective of thinking about youth and the idea of people coming to a show to kind of reimagine themselves, remember their youth, incorporate youth as an aspect of their ongoing imagining of social identity, but also of the fieldwork context, that you have to kind of dare to engage in this and to learn all these kinds of implicit lessons that I've mentioned in order to become part of this community of practice and learn exactly what it means to learn in this particular context. I'm the one with the beard in the video. Thanks very much for listening.